Hello, I'm Peter Viechnicki from Johns Hopkins University, and I'm here today to talk about our paper, Large-Scale Bitext Corpora Provide New Evidence for Cognitive Representations of Spatial Terms. And this is joint work with my co-authors Kevin Du, Anthony Kostakos, and Barbara Landau, also from Johns Hopkins. So we're going to be talking about spatial terms, and let me start by just defining what I mean by spatial terms. So these are expressions that express a spatial relationship between two objects, commonly referred to as the figure and the ground. In many languages, these are realized using adpositions or spatial nominals or other types of linguistic categories. A couple of English examples are words like below, the apple is below the table, in, the apples are in the bowl, or on, the apple is on the table. There's been a long-standing debate over many years about the universal properties of spatial expressions, and there's been a search to understand the cognitive representations that make up these spatial terms. And two approaches have dominated. One approach is a geometric approach, which has treated spatial concepts essentially as vectors, rooted in the navigational system in the human brain. So relying on direction and distance from reference objects. The other approach is a functional approach, which has been rooted in understanding of the properties of the figure and the ground objects themselves, and has typically relied on relationships that are less about exact physical location and more about things like containment or support relationships between the figure and the ground object. A couple of years ago, my colleague Barbara Landau put forward a new hypothesis that actually both types of cognitive relations exist in languages across the world, and that there's a division of labor, in fact, between the two of them. So Barbara hypothesizes that there are actually two distinct classes of spatial terms, one geometric and one functional, and then has begun to amass evidence in support of this view. So let's talk a little bit more about those two hypothetical classes of spatial terms. So starting with geometric representations of spatial concepts. Again, these would be based on the physical location of the object that is the figure with regard to a ground or reference object. And in order to express this relationship, what needs to happen is typically just to select a reference system. There's only a limited number of reference systems that are commonly used across the world's languages. Some common ones are egocentric references or geocentric reference systems. And once that reference system is selected, then the choice of the spatial term to describe the relationship is straightforward, and it would typically occur along one of three primary, secondary, or tertiary axes in that reference system. So here I'm showing a picture that shows those three axes, and then you can see above, left of, and in front of are all different ways of expressing a geometric relationship within that reference system. Turning now to the hypothetical functional class of spatial terms. These are more complicated. They have sometimes been called force dynamic in the cognitive science literature because understanding such relationships requires us to know many things about the properties of the figure and the ground object that are in the spatial relationship. Sometimes we might need to construe one of the objects as a type of container, or to understand the way one of the objects supports another. And what we typically see is a good deal of variation across contexts, across cultures, in the way that these construals are made. So here I'm showing on the right a picture of a fly on a ceiling. So the fly is on the ceiling, even though the physical location of the fly is, of course, actually under the ceiling. And then I'm showing a picture of flowers in a vase. The mass of the blooms, particularly of the flowers, are not inside the perimeter of the vase at all. Nevertheless, the vase is seen to contain the flowers in English. So with the hypothesis that there are these two distinct classes of spatial terms come certain implications, and what we're doing today is testing one of those implications. So in particular, the implication is that there should be less variation across languages in the geometric class of spatial terms as compared to the spatial terms that are in the functional class, which should exhibit more variability across languages. And when I'm talking about variability, let me just be clear on what I mean. So what I'm saying is that there would be either a greater or a lesser number of second language, target language terms that would correspond to a particular spatial term in a language like English, for example. So for example, assuming that the spatial term left of is a geometric spatial term, we can see that there's only really one French spatial term that expresses that same spatial relationship. Contrast that with a functional or force dynamic term like on, and we can see that in French there are a number of spatial terms that express that same English spatial relationship in different contexts. So that is the hypothesis that we will be testing during today's research. So let's talk about our methods. So our method is to extract basic locative constructions from a large corpus of Bitext, parallel sentences in English paired with another language, one of 8 languages, pairs of sentences that have the same meanings. Basic locative constructions are sentences which answer the question, where is the figure in relation to the ground? And these are things that occur in all languages and are good frames to test the cognitive representations of spatial concepts. Our pipeline consists of 3 major stages. It has a lexical filter, which looks for particular lexical items. It has a syntactic filter, which looks for those basic locative constructions. And finally, it has a concreteness filter, which tries to filter out temporal and other non-spatial uses of spatial terms. It is an effective pipeline, although, as we'll talk about at the end, its precision is better than its recall. Once we filter out a set of basic locative constructions, then what we do is we measure, again, the correspondence between English spatial terms on the one hand and the spatial terms that correspond in those same sentences in the target language. We essentially count up the co-occurrences between those sets of terms, and then we calculate the Shannon entropy statistic, and that is what we report in this research. We do apply a correction to reduce bias of the Shannon entropy, and I'm showing you the formula that we use for Shannon entropy at the top right of this slide. So what did we find? Let me talk about that next. So our first approach was to take spatial terms and then apply a priori labels to them based on our reading of the linguistico-semantic literature. Then we can calculate the entropies for those terms across the 8 languages that are in our study and combine these into a single number that we report here. That's what I'm showing you in the figure on the right. So here I'm showing the mean entropy values for functional terms versus for geometric terms. The functional terms are shown in the blue box, and the geometric terms are shown in the yellow-orange box on the right. And you can immediately see that, in fact, the functional terms do have a higher mean entropy than the geometric terms. The value is around almost 1.5 for the functional class, and it's not quite 0.5 for the geometric class. The rank ordering of the terms follows the expected pattern based on the initial hypothesis. And also note that the variance of the two proposed classes matches the initial hypothesis. In other words, the variance of the functional terms is much greater than the variance of the geometric terms, which would follow from the fact that the use of the functional terms requires much more culturally conditioned and contextual knowledge than of the geometric terms. We wanted to check how robust our results were to the use of a priori labels on the terms themselves, and so we redid the analysis discarding those assumptions in the following way. We used mixture modeling to try to understand how many latent classes were present in our data without applying a priori spatial term class labels to the terms themselves, and that's what I'm showing you here. So on the left side of this slide, you see a figure that shows two different statistics for mixture modeling with different numbers of components. So the components are along the x-axis. You can see between 1 and 5 components are shown here. And what you can see is that there's a kind of a cut point where there's a great change in both statistics at number 2. So we do find that 2 components most accurately describes the data that we have from the 8 languages. With the idea that there are in fact 2 latent classes present in our data, we then wondered how well do those 2 data-driven components match up with the a priori labels we used in the previous slide, and that's what I'm showing you in the table on the right. So you can see the agreement matrix between again the data-driven mixture modeling components and the a priori labels from the previous slide. And so the cases where they agree are the ones that are on the diagonal, so the top left and the bottom right. And you can see that 18 of the 22 spatial terms that we were studying showed agreement between the a priori class labels and the mixture model components that we're reporting here. So this makes us feel that our results are relatively robust, at least for this particular sample of languages. So in conclusion, what did we find? So we do find that a functional class of terms does have significantly different mean entropies as compared to geometric spatial terms. So we do find this follows the hypothesis that those 2 classes of terms would have different cross-linguistic variability. The direction of that difference, again, is consistent with that initial hypothesis, as is the larger variance of the functional class as compared to the geometric class. We do note that our results are based on a sample of only 8 languages, 7 of which are Indo-European, and thus we view them as preliminary. We would very much like to replicate this initial finding with a more diverse language sample, and particularly one that contains more languages with complex morphology systems. We would also like to continue to improve our extraction pipeline that filters out basic locative constructions so that we could increase the number of data points in our analysis. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to any questions.